Welcome back to Views with Hughes, Jennifer News. This is Jerome Hughes. Now, guess what? We're going to go ahead and get right into it. Now, as you all might have known, the real numbers behind the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, the Disney Star Wars project that, like so many others, under Kathleen Kennedy's watch, has basically failed to justify its astronomical costs. Now, the Acolyte Star Wars Failure was another costly misstep for Disney and Lucasfilm, representing a pattern of failures that we've seen time and time again. Now, some of you might have already heard about this massive price tag attached to the Acolyte with Star Wars Failure, but let's break it down so that way we can fully basically grasp this wasteful spending for the Acolyte Star Wars Failure that it truly was. Now, according to different tax documents filed by the Walt Disney Company's UK branch, Lucasfilm under Kathleen Kennedy and Disney spent over 172 million GBP, which is translates to about $231 million in US. And on the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, a prequel series set in the Disney Star Wars universe, the Acolyte Star Wars Failure was intended to be a high budget spectacle, but what we actually got was the Acolyte Star Wars Failure that it didn't, deliver on that particular investment. Now, just think about that for a second. $231 million for the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, a series that was destined to fail from the very beginning. The Acolyte Star Wars Failure ended up being a colossal waste of money and resources too, and including time, a recurring theme under Kathleen Kennedy and her leadership. Now, this brings me to also the show's creator, Leslie Headland. You see, the woman that Kathleen Kennedy chose to helm the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, Headland, in an interview with Vanity Fair, publicly claimed that, the Acolyte, which is Star Wars Failure, cost $180 million. Y'all remember that? I reported on that. But at the time, people assumed that she was talking about US dollars. But it turns out the Acolyte Star Wars Failure cost even more. Let me tell you, it's pretty clear that she was referring to British pounds. And when you account for the exchange rates, we're looking at the Acolyte Star Wars Failure costing almost $230 million in US. Now, for the Acolyte Star Wars Failure to cost that much, you would expect that it would be like a massive hit, right? Unfortunately, as we've seen, the Acolyte Star Wars Failure was anything but a hit, further demonstrating basically the mismanagement of Star Wars projects under Kennedy herself. Now, here's where it gets even more ridiculous. See, the Acolyte, the Star Wars Failure, was an 8-episode series, meaning that Lucasfilm basically just went on ahead and allowed the budget for the Acolyte Star Wars Failure to balloon to $28.5 million per episode. Now, I don't know about you, but for that kind of money, the Acolyte, the Star Wars Failure should have been groundbreaking. Okay, yet what we got was the Acolyte Star Wars Failure that failed to resonate with audiences, as is typical with many Disney Star Wars projects. Now, the Acolyte Star Wars Failure should have been a spectacle, but instead it became another example of waste and poor decision making of putting woke ideology into content at Lucasfilm and forgetting how to do storytelling. You see, the UK tax filings only account for the spending on the Acolyte Star Wars Failure before September 24, 2023. So we may not even know the full scope of the Acolyte Star Wars Failure's financial disaster yet. Now, that's the beauty of Hollywood accounting, isn't it? Right? Where, there's basically always more to the story. And usually the Acolyte Star Wars Failure ends up being even worse than we initially thought. Then again, there's not much of a surprise to me, but the Acolyte Star Wars Failure was released on June 4th, 2024. And guess what? The Acolyte Star Wars Failure failed to register on the Nielsen Top 10 overall chart. I've reported on that several times. The Acolyte Star Wars Failure was a $231 million production that couldn't even break into the top 10. Now, it only managed to scrape in onto the top 10 original streaming for Nielsen with 488 million minutes watched. And, then the Acolyte Star Wars Failure dropped off entirely by its 4th week. Now, this is what happens when identity politics are prioritized over good storytelling. Now, the Acolyte Star Wars Failure suffered for it. And you know what? The numbers reflect this particular failure to engage audiences, okay? And if you're not surprised about that, let me know your thoughts right in the comments below. But here's the kicker. The Acolyte Star Wars Failure did manage to reappear on the Nielsen Top 10 original streaming chart by July 16th when the finale aired, garnering about 335 million watch minutes. But even that wasn't even enough to save the Acolyte under Star Wars Failure, but ultimately it was canceled by the Walt Disney Company. Now, this isn't surprising. It's a pattern that we've seen time and time again under Kathleen Kennedy and her leadership. Another Star Wars series that misses the mark, basically. But as you all know, Kathleen Kennedy, of course, championed the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, and Leslie Headland promoting them in the press. Now let's think back to this. In a New York Times piece, Kennedy tried to defend the ridiculous spending on the Acolyte Star Wars Failure by talking about how important it was to have representation in storytelling. And she said, and I quote, "My belief is that storytelling does need to be representative of people. That's an easy decision for me. Yet, despite this, the Acolyte Star Wars Failure failed to go ahead and connect with the audience that it was supposed to represent." Why? Because it fell flat, much like other projects overseen by Kathleen Kennedy. Not to mention, a lot of people like that she's reaching out to don't even care about Star Wars. But I'm all for inclusion and everything, but let it be natural. And let's get real here. We're talking about the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, a Star Wars series that had millions of devoted fans who cared about compelling characters and well-crafted stories, not politically correct messaging. I do need to make a self-correction. Disney Star Wars, okay? So the Acolyte Star Wars Failure was a victim of this, and it's no wonder that why it failed to basically capture the hearts of its audience. And Kennedy went on to say, operated within these giant franchises now with social media and a level of expectation is terrifying. I think Leslie has struggled with a bit of with the Acolyte Star Wars. I think a lot of people, a lot of women who step into Star Wars struggle with this a bit more because of the fan base being so male dominated that they sometimes get attacked in ways that can be quite personal. Really? So basically what I'm getting here is that Kathleen Kennedy stating that they admitted that they lack creativity, okay? And also, this right here, what she said, what I quoted her saying, this right here is Kennedy trying to shift the blame for the Acolyte Star Wars Failure onto the fans, specifically male fans who form the core of the Star Wars audience. But here's the thing, it's not about the sex of a person or personal attacks. Fans aren't upset because a woman is running the Acolyte Star Wars Failure. They're upset because the Acolyte Star Wars Failure was just plain bad. It's always been easier for Kathleen Kennedy to go ahead and blame the fans rather than take accountability and make her own leadership failures. Okay. Now, on the other hand, Leslie Headland herself admitted that if the Acolyte Star Wars Failure failed, it would be her fault. Well, guess what, people? The Acolyte Star Wars Failure itself did fail, and while she might take the blame, the reality is the disaster is a part of a much larger trend under Kathleen Kennedy's leadership. Now, Lucasfilm has a history of throwing obscene amounts of money at projects that have no chance of success, including the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, which is yet another example. Now, this particular overspending and lack of accountability is another reason why Disney also continues to hemorrhage money, basically. But that's no surprise to any of us for if you think about it. But speaking of the Iger, the UK tax filings also revealed that Lucasfilm has already spent at least $362 million making Andor. A lot of people say that Andor is the best thing to come out of Disney Star Wars, but let's be honest, people. Hardly anyone watched Andor, and sure, it may have been better than the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, but $362 million for a show that didn't have widespread appeal, I mean, that's more money down the drain, and it highlights the same issue that we saw in the Acolyte Star Wars Failure. All right, and this isn't limited to Star Wars, but remember the Willow reboot on Disney Plus. Kathleen Kennedy herself approved of the spending almost $170 million to bring Willow to life, only for it to flop so hard that Bob Iger wiped Willow from existence. That's right, you can't even legally purchase or view Willow anymore, and Disney took it as a complete loss for tax purposes, much like the Acolyte Star Wars Failure. Now, both series highlight the ongoing failures in decision making and direction at Lucasfilm. And You know what? We kept talking about this before. We kept seeing it. And this is what happens when you let Kathleen Kennedy run the show. Now, time after time, Kathleen Kennedy is proving that she's more interested in pushing a woke political agenda instead of just creating quality content. And the Acolyte Star Wars Failure is basically a prime example. Now, under her leadership, Lucasfilm has become a synonymous with failure, and Bob Iger continues to let her run wild with the company's money, allowing the Acolyte Star Wars Failure to go ahead and become another wasted opportunity. Okay, but I mean, at the end of the day, this is a leadership problem. Kennedy has been allowed to oversee a series of failures, whether it's the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, Andor, or the now vanished Willow reboot, and Iger is doing nothing to go ahead and rein it in. But meanwhile, Disney is hemorrhaging money on these projects that aren't even resonating with fans, alienating the very people who made Star Wars the cultural phenomenon that it once was. All right. After all, the Acolyte Star Wars Failure should have been a turning point, but instead it became another financial disaster. Okay. So basically, what's the takeaway here? Well, it's quite simple. You see, Kathleen Kennedy is driving Lucasfilm into the ground, and Bob Iger is just idly standing by and letting it happen. Now, whether it's by, greenlighting expensive flops like the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, or allowing projects like Willow to disappear into oblivion, but it's clear that Disney's leadership has lost sight of what makes Star Wars great in the first place. But look, until Disney realizes that, fans actually want, good stories and not lectures, we're going to keep seeing these massive financial disasters like the Acolyte Star Wars Failure. All right. But after all, Kathleen Kennedy can try to blame the fans all she wants, but the truth is out there for everyone to see. She's failing, and the Acolyte Star Wars Failure is just the latest example in a long line of horrible choices. And yeah, basically, this is just another colossal failure brought to you by Kathleen Kennedy, Bob Iger, Leslie Headland, and even Disney Machine. Now, just hoping for the sake of Star Wars and its legacy that someone in charge wakes up and realizes what's happening before it's too late. Now, with the Star Wars Acolyte Failure, with the Acolyte Star Wars Failure, we've seen yet another example of decline of Lucasfilm under her leadership. So let me know your thoughts about this in the comments below. Also, be sure to include any additional thoughts you may have this particular topic. If you enjoyed what I shared in this video, go ahead, smash the like button, share far wide across social media. And if you have done so already and you enjoyed all the content that I put there, go ahead, subscribe to the channel, click the bell notification so that way you'll be notified of future uploads and updates. Till then, peace.